welcome and thank you so much for joining us here in Davos. Upon Vlad, thank you so much to do this together today.
Thank you for having us.
And thank God, we're not asked to read the geopolitical tea leaves and what precisely is coming out of Davos. What we'd really like to do is go deep into all the conversations you've had with CEOs, with leaders in business and society about what they're really trying to learn here, what they're discussing, what some of their big concerns and hopes are that they're taking away from Davos, and really get behind the scenes, understand what's going on, and what substance is really on people's minds. And Afana, I'd like to start with you. I mean, not only from a geopolitical and global advantage perspective that you spend so much time and energy on, but what do you feel are the precise topics that most leaders wanted to exchange with you on this week?
I mean, you know that the last several years have been very charged geopolitically. And we started this year on a similar note. There's a lot of events that happened just in the 1 month leading up to Davos. So what's on leaders' mind? I mean, optimistically speaking, I'm glad to hear that people are trying to think about growth a lot. And that's a positive. Last year, I think with the tariffs, with all the volatility, with so many uncertainties, most leaders were bunkering down and they were sort of waiting out the storm and waiting for the dust to settle to make some decisions. This year, it's turned a corner where leaders are saying, I can only suspend bold moves, strategic bets so long, and some of the volatility and uncertainty will remain, and they're starting to make strategic bets. And you see that in how big M&A is back on the table, growth agendas are back on the table, and so you're starting to see this conversation around growth come in. Having said that, there's also a balancing act with resilience. And one of the themes I'm hearing from CEOs in panels we sit in, or in the dinners that we hosted yesterday, we hosted a geopolitics dinner from BCG. The common theme is that resilience and growth have become interconnected like never before. If you have resilience and buffers in your supply chains, in your P&L, you can make a bet on growth despite the volatility. And that for me is a good takeaway for CEOs.
Vlad, I remember when you told me a couple of years ago at the Davos that I could queue at the Microsoft cafe and they would teach me in 20 minutes what an idiot needed to know on ChatGPT, right? So I think that feels like the very distant past. There's obviously a lot of discussion on AI here. Lots of questions if that is a bubble. What's the substance on AI, the really substantive discussion that you find most relevant here?
Yeah, there is a conversation. Is it a bubble more broadly from the investor side, etc., which is a separate topic. There's a second question around, is it a fad and is it a bubble from the deployment and usage side? And that part, it's absolutely not a bubble. It's amazing to see how the overall level of literacy around AI has increased through the ranks of the executives. This was the first year where most of the conversations were actually with CEOs, not with their CIOs or CTOs around, hey, deploy this magical thing and hopefully magic happens, but about what they're doing to drive the adoption, the usage, because they see what the art of the possible is. They're also much more realistic around what it takes to deploy it. There was one theme that's been popping up amongst executives when they really tell you the great examples where it's working and where they're unlocking value. It's simplicity of the play. They can really sharply articulate what it is they're doing, why they're focused on it, and persistence of the motion. It's not, we'll see for 3 months and, if it doesn't work, we move on. They're like, no, there is value. So if it's not working, what are we doing wrong? And how do we make sure we create the right environments? So that's been just fascinating to see that, executives get it, they're driving it, and this is going to stay for a while.
A lot of the questions I got was also on how do I make it work together with my workforce? How do I really get people behind it? You've always pointed out that the human dimension is the most important one in AI adoption. Where do you feel we've made progress?
Well, first, in acknowledging that and understanding that that's the unlock. Two, that there is no silver bullets and that you cannot do it without it. So just general awareness of that. And then the companies are changing operating model, I guess, is the best expression of how they talk about it, how frequently they meet about it. It is not seen as something that is just the techies need to do, but the business owners are the ones that see that they are the critical component of driving it. So just they're creating the right context to have the right conversations, and then they're figuring out their company-specific plays. That's the exciting part for me. Is people are not trying to deploy a blueprint template. They're actually saying, what is my AI angle? And the only way you get to that is if your workforce is thinking through it and owning it.
Vlad, you mentioned that the nature of the conversation has changed and how AI is being brought to executive teams. The same holds true for trade and geopolitics, Aparna, right? And you said that the last year was tough and had a lot of volatility, uncertainty, completely new topics for executive teams. You've often talked about geopolitical muscle and the capability that top teams need to build. Where do companies stand and what have you learned this week?
So we had some encouraging news on trade compared to what we expected last year. When Liberation Day happened, the expectation was that, the tariffs will lead to some sort of a contagion scenario. Every country would put tariff barriers against each other and we'll have a collapse of global trade. I'm glad to say that that didn't happen. So we just redid our trade model and we released that publication. And in that, you see a slight slowdown in global trade from 2.8% to 2.5% for the next 10 years. But you don't see the collapse that everyone predicted. And so I think that is definitely encouragement. So I take away from that there is a certain core resilience in global matters, and that core resilience endures between businesses despite what's happening between nations. And with that, one of the things that we've been trying to tell business leaders who ask us, I haven't caused any of this, but I'm facing a lot of this context. What can I do? And we say, build a geopolitical muscle. I can talk about that more in detail later, but in very short, just like you have the capability to drive AI, and Vlad, you said it's driven by the CEO, by the entire organization, similarly, you need a capability to drive geopolitical responses. And it needs to be embedded in your organization, not parked in a global affairs team with slightly more people involved, but not embedded in the business. So that's a geopolitical muscle. I can talk more about it later.
Thank you. You also spoke about growth. As we know, a lot of the growth we've seen in many markets in the world has been very much driven by AI in the past year. If you look at some of the big growth vectors that we're going to see, where do the CEOs that you've met this week put most of their hope and aspiration in?
That's a good one. There's no, it's so industry specific, right? And what is really good as they reflect on the growth is there's a much sharper articulation of value they're bringing to the market. The last few years was like geopolitical backdrop. I don't know how it's going to play out. We got to keep our options open, and AI is coming and disrupting the business. This year, the difference was, you know what, we're focused on this segment and we're going to provide the following services. This is our differentiation. So again, from industry to industry, it's different. But what was unique this year was the articulation of those plays has been much sharper than what I've heard in the last few years.
It's interesting, Locke, that you're saying this. I met the Asia Pacific head of one of the big insurance companies this week, and she said, look, actually, yes, there's a lot of uncertainty, but I think distraction is a huge risk, is how she put it. And she basically said, look, I know the 2-3 growth vectors of my region where I have to win, regardless of what else is happening on the planet. And if we're going to focus on this, we're going to be in a better place by the end of the year. And I think that's also a bit what you're describing. Yes. How do you look at it, Aparna?
No, so I think there are still tremendous growth opportunities. And what I'm hearing from leaders is 2 themes. The first theme is the Global South. And so Global South is almost a neutral group of emerging markets, 133 of them, where they do business across geopolitical rifts. And many businesses are taking a close look at the Global South, from fashion and luxury all the way to automotive, to find opportunities in those. The other is the opposite, and I think it links to the middle powers conversation we heard yesterday from Mark Kearney and several others. This idea that there are challenger companies emerging and wanting to become leaders. So challenger companies are companies based out of India, out of Turkey, out of China, out of Brazil, that are seeking to go global and are seeking to bring their products to a vast majority of markets. In the process, they're professionalizing, they're building governance systems similar to multinationals, and you're starting to see a more diverse group of emerging leaders as a result of that. So both of those from a global perspective is happening despite the geopolitics, even benefiting from the geopolitics, and gives growth opportunities.
I mean, it's interesting what you've both been describing. We came out of a Davos last year where many business leaders felt that, wow, we're a bit like the deer in headlights conversation, right? A lot of new challenges to face, teams to upskill, etc. What you've been describing is a more focus in a number of dimensions, more focus on growth, more focus on how to extract value from investments, like in investments in AI. I felt a conversation I heard a bit less about this year was the whole question on talent. Where's talent missing? Where do we have to proof for new talent? Talent and AI. And I guess you've probably heard more of it in your conversations, and like very interested in what you see.
Yeah, it's a great observation. Like, I expect that's going to be the theme next year. Because, like, it feels last 2 years like the cards and dice were thrown in the air and everybody was waiting to see how it all shakes out. On the tech side, AI side, on the geopolitical side, a lot of those dice are down. And folks are now, okay, I have enough points of reference within which I'm going to figure out what I'm going to focus on. And they're articulating that and they're doubling down. Next year, I'm anticipating, hey, I've been focusing on this. I just can't get enough people that can do this, this, and this. Where do I go? So let's see if my projection works next year. But yeah, this year was not so much around talent. It was around sharpness of the strategic plays and articulating those and sharing them, getting investors and community excited about that. I do think next bottleneck now will be talent and how do I do that? So
Yeah. And from a globalization perspective, we did a lot of research on global talent. And last year, global talent mobility declined. And I think that's something that businesses would watch out for. And I agree, Vlad, talent will become a much more top of mind topic. Top talent is rare. There are certain countries that are sources of top talent. There are certain countries that absorb top talent, US, Singapore, so on and so forth. And there's a mismatch in those movements, and it has to connect to immigration policies and things like that. So I think as AI evolves, as the needs and the capabilities evolve very rapidly, this question of talent will be front and center. I feel businesses are now getting to a point which is more end-to-end holistic change management, and immediately after that comes the question of talent. So I agree. I also think it'll be a top topic next year.
I'd like to move with you to sources of innovation. And Vlad, we had a discussion with a medtech executive on precisely that, right? If you look at the industry I serve, biopharma, a big discussion this year that we've also seen here and that we haven't seen to the same extent before is the enormous wave of very high quality innovation coming out of China for new molecules, not copies, but really genuine innovation. China constitutes now a third of the world's industry pipeline, 50% of some drug classes like ADCs. And as you reflected on, that has happened in a number of industries. If you look at some of the early indicators of that, in the biopharma industry, the relevant scientific publications of China overtook the US in 2019. To actually now they're roughly a third higher. You could argue we could have seen this coming. And that's obviously now one big source of innovation, and that's going to only pick up. How do you look at sources of innovation and growth in the areas that you serve?
Maybe I can speak to it from a global perspective because we spend a lot of time understanding China and understanding global competition in that sense. So I take the topic of AI. I mean, I think US and China are both very credible AI superpowers right now. What we saw evolving from China, from DeepSeek all the way now, you can see that there's a lot of depth in the AI innovation that's coming out of China. I think the battlegrounds are going to be the middle powers in the global south, where both these models are available, some more cost effective than the others, and capabilities vary, and companies will have to make choices. That's one. The other thing I wanted to say on innovation is the innovation patterns between these superpowers are often very different. So the Chinese innovation is backed by a lot of VC funding, backed by government funding, while in US it's a lot of big tech funding getting in from the markets. So there's a difference in the model, but there is agility in both those models, and both can create very successful solutions. I think for businesses, the question would be around their operating model, their tech stacks, questions around data sovereignty, and then there's a complex algorithm they need to solve for the choices that they need to make. You are already seeing a lot of Chinese hardware and telco infrastructure in the global south. And the question is open on what that may look like in AI in the future. But one of the things I'm hearing this year more than any other time in Davos is respect for what China has been able to achieve through innovation. And I think the theme is pragmatic. A look at that to say, what is the model that works for us? What is the model that is competitive for us and conforms with how we want to do business? But let's take a close look at what different superpowers in AI particularly are providing as solutions.
Vlad, I guess everyone always expects innovation from you, right? Being so deep in AI. But what specifically do you feel leaders should watch out for in terms of sources of innovation?
Yeah, I think it's actually fascinating. What we've learned through time is that unconstrained innovation ends up like it's a hit or miss and it's all over the place. What has happened with geopolitical constraints over the last few years in individual countries, the boundaries of what they can do and want to do are much tighter, and innovation then thrives. Now, what that means is we're getting like very different types of models coming out of China, coming out of India, coming out of Japan than what we're getting coming from European, some small countries that are in the European Union or outside of it versus in the US. So the comparison, it's going to be tougher, but we will have more choices. There is actually more innovation. If I go back 5 years back on the tech side, everybody was going after the same market and trying to compete in the same way, regardless of where they came from. Now, when I talk about tech, like there are things that are being built that are serving purposes that, like in other countries, people are not even thinking about. So it just
What's an example of that?
think about consumer consumption. Like in the past was like if you're a Chinese or I don't know, Eastern European startup in tech, like your holy grail is to build an app for the US consumer. Right now, you go talk to companies there, they don't even think about U.S. consumer at all. Like a company in Eastern Europe is focused on agricultural precision farming in Hungary and in Poland, and they're directing their energy there. They're not wasting time on building an app that might be applicable to consumers in the U.S. So like they're like channeling the energy into markets that they feel are more accessible to them, and the money that is being invested into them is chasing those specific theses that are different than they were in the past. And in the past, they were much more uniform, like size-wise. It was the Chinese consumer and the US consumer, go for that. Now it is much more the average, much more focused, but therefore solutions are different. And so as someone who's thirsting for innovation to deploy it, like I'm getting so many more different examples of technical solutions. It's also resulting in very different technical architectures, some of them super clever, that you need to make it work within a smaller market with a much smaller budget. The business case is very different, and suddenly, boy, if you could take that out and deploy in a different market at a different scale, it just becomes interesting. So that's going to be the new challenge. How do we excavate these, to your point? How do we make them accessible, visible, and then it might feel more challenging to executive teams how to harness them, but those who figure that model will bring so much more innovation to their solutions. So that few interesting observations.
Aparna, you've said it before, leaders have had a lot coming at them in the past, let's say, 24 months. One CEO said to me yesterday, he said, look, it always feels frivolous that I take a week for Davos, but I'm learning so much. And on the Better Up, Shall I Quit Up, the session was Brene Brown and Adam Grant yesterday. One of the discussions was that one of the hallmarks of a good leader is that creating time between the impulse and what's happening and the reaction. And a lot of the discussion was like quality decision-making, trading off, learning about your options, what to do. It happens in that time between stimulus and reaction. But leaders very often don't have that time. And what we've heard a lot this week and in general is, where do they take the time to learn? And what are they learning that they really feel they need to steer their businesses in the right direction in the next year? And I'm just curious to hear in your conversation what you feel leaders have invested real time on to learn for the year ahead.
So I was in a panel with a few public and private sector leaders, and the nicest summary and the takeaway for this was, we should spend as much time listening to optimistic business leaders in this day and age as we spend listening to doomsaying economists. I think there's a balance there. And I think optimistic business leaders is a good theme for this Davos. What I learned was that businesses are seeking a way out. They realize that, they spend time waiting. They can only wait so long. There is a new energy to say, let's find a way around this. Now, that way may be different. Some people are innovating out of it. Some people are looking for new markets. Some people are pivoting their operating models and securing their supply chains in a different way. But each of the conversations, I'd say, in Davos is about how do I find a way that brings me back to growth, to momentum. And I think that's an optimistic way to start the year. And for me, that was the biggest learning for this year. Thank you.
Yeah, on my end, I was surprised with the genuine curiosity that came from a lot of leaders. They were, um, tone was a little bit different. Like in the past, they were either complaining about things or sharing what they want to really push as an agenda. This year was much more questions like, hey, but how do you guys do this? And how do you guys do that? And did you try that? And so I found it much more stimulating in terms of it seems like they were problem solving for specific things and looking to kind of connect the dots. And that there was thirst in questions that were coming out versus I'm here to convey the greatness of what we're doing or to push a specific agenda. So like from that angle, it was much more stimulating set of conversations.
And probably to link to what Aparna just said, there has in a very polarized age, it's very easy to get caught in a doom loop, right? Very personally, if you look at the beginning of this year and what you expect at the end of 2026, what is an area where you're hopeful that we will be much better off at the end of the year than at the beginning?
Ooh, that's a good one. We should script these things so then I would have the ready answers. Listen, I last few years was a lot of uncertainty, a lot of anxiety, like across the world. There is a whole generation that grew up in one kind of world order that is being shaken to the core. And beginning of this year was a bit of that uncertainty. What I'm seeing is people actually figuring out bridges to work as a kind of global community to advance us all collectively. And I'm more hopeful than ever around the resilience of that, and that coming at the end of 26, we're gonna reignite that global community that is kind of pushing us as a race forward. So that's kind of my secret hope that's beyond just the tech topics.
Thank you. Aparna?
Hope, and I think my expectation too, is that more businesses will have a geopolitical muscle. The reason I believe that is 3 or 4 years ago, most of what the BCG Global Advantage team and what I did was geopolitical education. What is this lingo? What is economic statecraft? Help me navigate and just get the vocabulary. The last 2 years, it has been about geopolitical capabilities. And CEOs are starting to really understand the lingo and go beyond it to get to solutions and get to new ways of working. And now you're already seeing North Star companies that are doing this in the right way. It started with the automotive, the medtech, the most geopolitically exposed sectors, fashion, luxury, so on. But now it's becoming more broad-based. So my hope at the end of this year is that more companies will have that geopolitical muscle, and it'll become part of risk planning. It'll become part of volatility management and ingrained in business processes. So let's see if that happens next year, but that's my hope and expectation.
Aparna, Vlad, thank you so much for joining me. Thank you for allowing all of us to have a look behind the curtain on what you've heard this week, and safe journey home.
Thank you, Judith. Same to you.
Yeah, thank you both.